Shalom, everybody. We're going to be looking at the Book of Jasher, chapter 8, verses 1 through 36, and this portion corresponds to the Book of Genesis, chapter 11, verses 26 and 27. So let's begin with Jasher, chapter 8. And it was the night that Abram was born that all the servants of Terah and all the wise men of Nimrod and his conjurers came and ate and drank in the house of Terah, and they rejoiced with him on that night. And when all the wise men and conjurers went from the house of Terah, they lifted up their eyes toward the heaven that night to look at the stars, and they saw, and behold, one very large star came up from the east, and ran in the heavens, and swallowed up the 4 stars from the 4 sides of the heavens. So if we look at right now, we see that the wise men of Nimrod and his servants, they went to Terah's house to have a banquet. As they left, they saw this pretty incredible heavenly sight, right? They saw a huge star consume 4 stars on the 4 ends of heaven, or the 4 corners of the universe, right? North, east, south, and west. So these wise men, I believe, are what we call the beginning of the Magi. In Daniel chapter 2, you see that when Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, dream that he actually forgot about when he woke up. He had this huge dream about a statue, and then he consults his astrologers and his wise men. They weren't able to give him the interpretation. But so that's one version of the Magi in the days of Daniel, in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, and also in the days of Jesus. When Jesus was born, we know that the same Magi, obviously the lineage, it's the same lineage, but it's obviously a different generation of Magi, come when they see Jesus' star in the east, and they come, asking Herod where the king of the Jews is, right? So in the days of Yeshua, or the days of Jesus, we see the same wise men. So this is I believe this is the beginning of the lineage of the Magi, these wise men of Nimrod. So let's pick it up in verse 3. And all the wise men of the king and his conjurers were astonished at the sight, and the sages understood this matter, and they knew its import. And they said to each other, "This only betokens a child that has been born to Terah this night, who will grow up and be fruitful and multiply and possess all the earth, he and his children forever, and he and his seed will slay great kings and inherit their lands." So it's I think it's a very interesting parallel how on the night Abraham was born, there's a pretty incredible scene in the sky with the stars, right? And also there's also a star that heralded the coming of the King of the Jews, who is Jesus, or Yeshua HaMashiach. So in Genesis 12 and Genesis 22, we look at that's the Abrahamic covenant that God makes with Abraham, and we notice that so is the wise men, they pretty much get it right. It says in verse 4, and they said to each other, "This only betokens the child that has been born to Terah this night, who will grow up and be fruitful and multiply and possess all the earth, he and his children forever, and he and his seed will slay great kings and inherit their lands." So in Genesis 12, we see that we see the Abrahamic covenant also in Genesis 22, where God promises to make Abraham a great nation, and he will bless those that curse him. Bless those he bless his nation, and curse those who curse him. And also that Abraham's descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and also as numerous as the sands on the seashore. And then the second part of the Nimrod's wise men's prophecy was that his seed will slay great kings, and that's that's what we see as the children of Israel go into the promised land. The Lord uses them to bring judgment on many nations, and we see those nations, some of those nations in Deuteronomy chapter 7, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, Perizzites, and the Hivites and the Jebusites and whatnot. So obviously, God did use the children of Israel to bring judgment on many nations, and for many reasons. I believe the biggest reason was to pretty much to deal with the problem of the Nephilim, because the Bible clearly says that there were giants in the land. So I think well, it's not only so much a problem with sin, or that God is racist, or that God this is just judging nations for no reason. But obviously, I believe there's a huge problem with sin and the mixing of fallen angel genes with human genes and whatnot, and that's what we call, what many people call the Nephilim. And I believe that the children of Israel were sent to pretty much deal with the problem of the Nephilim, and that's why they were told to pretty much annihilate whole nations. So anyway, so it's pretty interesting that these wise men kind of they pretty much understand the time, they understand the starry vision. They pretty much are able to explain it pretty accurately. So let's pick it up in verse 5. And the wise men and the conjurers went home that night, and in the morning all these wise men and conjurers rose up early and assembled in an appointed house. And they spoke and said to each other, Behold, the sight that we saw last night is hidden from the king. It has not been made known to him. The king being Nimrod. And should this thing get known by the king in the latter days, he will say to us, Why have you concealed this matter from me? And then we shall suffer death. Therefore, now let us go up and tell the king the sight which we saw and the interpretation thereof, and we shall then remain clear. And they did so, and they all went to the king and bowed down to him to the ground, and they said, May the king live, and may the king live. We heard that a son was born to Terah, the son of Nahor, the prince of thy host, and we yesternight came to his house, and we ate and drank and rejoiced with him that night. So we understand that Abraham's dad, Terah, was kind of like an army general. He was a prince of the army. Verse 10. And when thy servants went down from the house of Terah to go to our respective homes to abide there for the night, we lifted up our eyes to heaven, and we saw a great star coming from the east, and the same star ran with great speed and swallowed up the 4 great stars from the 4 sides of the heavens. And thy servants were astonished at the sight which we saw, and were greatly terrified, and we made our judgment upon the sight, and knew by our wisdom the proper interpretation thereof, that this thing applies to the child that is born to Terah, who will grow up and multiply greatly and become powerful and kill all kings of the earth and inherit all their lands, he and his seed forever. So that's kind of almost like a messianic prophecy, because it's very interesting. In the same chapter of Daniel, chapter 2, there's going to be a small stone that was this small stone that's going to break the statue that Nebuchadnezzar dreamt of. The head of gold, the arms and chest of silver, the belly of brass, and the arms, and the legs of iron. That statue was going to be struck down by a rock, and that rock would turn into a great mountain, and that rock is a messianic prophecy in Daniel chapter 2. And through Jesus Christ, that's how Abraham's seed will be established forever. And now, our Lord and King, behold, we have truly acquainted thee with what we have seen concerning this child. Again, we can look at the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12 and 22 and in Deuteronomy 7. If it seemeth good to the king to give his father value for this child, we will slay him before he shall grow up and increase in the land, and his evil increase against us, that we and our children perish, that we and our children perish through this evil. And the king heard their words, and they seemed good in his sight, and he sent and called for Terah, and Terah came before the king. And the king said to Terah, I have been told that a son was yesternight born to thee, and after this manner was observed in the heavens at his birth. And now therefore give me the child, that we may slay him before his evil springs up against us, and I will give thee his value, thy house full of silver and gold. And Terah answered to the king and said to him, my lord and king, I have heard thy words, and thy servant shall do all that the king desireth. But my lord and king, I will tell thee what happened to me yesternight, that I may see what advice the king will give his servant, and then I will answer the king upon what he has just spoken. And the king said, Speak. And Terah said to the king, Ion, son of Mored, came to me yesternight, saying, give unto me the great and beautiful horse that the king gave thee, and I will give thee silver and gold, and straw and provender for its value. And I said to him, Wait till I see the king concerning thy words, and behold, whatever the king saith, that will I do. Just a side note that provender is a word that means like fodder or animal feed. Verse 21. And now, my lord and king, behold, I have made this thing known to thee, and the advice which my king will give unto his servant, that will I follow. So this is actually we're about to see that this is actually kind of like almost like an allegory that Terah is saying is just told the king to see how he would react. You know, it's like kind of like a similar situation. He wants to see how Nimrod will react. And the king heard the words of Terah, and his anger was kindled, and he considered him in the light of a fool. And the king answered Terah, and he said to him, Art thou so silly, ignorant, or deficient in understanding to do this thing, to give thy beautiful horse for silver and gold, or even for straw and provender? Art thou so short of silver and gold that thou shouldest do this thing because thou canst not obtain straw and provender to feed thy horse? And what is silver and gold to thee, or straw and provender, that thou shouldest give away that fine horse which I gave thee, like which there is none to be had on the whole earth? And the king left off speaking, and Terah answered the king, saying, Like unto this has the king spoken to his servant. I beseech thee, my lord and king, what is this which thou didst say unto me, saying, Give thy son so that we may slay him, and I will give thee silver and gold for his value? What shall I do with silver and gold after the death of my son? Who shall inherit me? Surely then at my death the silver and gold will return to my king who gave it. Wow, that's pretty wise. So he's pretty much saying, look, how are you going to compare a horse to my child? You know, the child that I'm going to give my inheritance to. And you know, Nimrod obviously, you know, he's so depraved he can't even tell the difference between, he can't even assess the value, the much greater value that a human life has over an animal. So that's his total depravity right there. So let's look at verse 27. And I like how Terah kind of throws it back at him with that allegory, saying, look, my son is much more valuable than the horse that you gave me, the horse that there was, none other like that in the whole earth. And this is wisdom. It's like, look, you can pretty much you'll probably get the gold and silver back when I die anyway. So I mean, you're not even losing anything. You just want to kill my son and not even really, there's no way to compensate the life of a human being, obviously, right? So let's look at verse 27. And when the king heard the words of Terah and the parable which he brought concerning the king, it grieved him greatly, and he was vexed at this thing, and his anger burned within him. And Terah saw that the anger of the king was kindled against him, and he answered the king, saying, All that I have is in the king's power. Whatever the king desireth to do to his servant, that let him do. Yea, even my son, he is in the king's power, without value in exchange, he and his 2 brothers that are older than he. And the king said to Terah, No, but I will purchase thy son for a price. And Terah answered the king, saying, I beseech thee, my lord and king, to let thy servant speak a word before thee, and let the king hear the word of his servant. And Terah said, Let my king give me 3 days time, till I consider this matter within myself and consult with my family concerning the words of my king. And he pressed the king greatly to agree to this. And the king hearkened to Terah, and he did so, and he gave him 3 days time. And Terah went out from the king's presence, and he came to his family and spoke to them all the words of the king, and the people were greatly afraid. And it was in the it was in the third day that the king sent to Terah, saying, Send me thy son for a price, as I spoke to thee, and thou shouldest thou not do this, I will send and slay all thou hast in thy house, so that thou shalt not even have a dog remaining. And Terah hastened, as the thing was urgent from the king, and he took a child from one of his servants, which his handmaid had borne to him that day, and Terah brought the child to the king and received value for him. And the Lord was with Terah in this matter, that Nimrod might not cause Abraham's death. And the king took the child from Terah, and with all his might dashed his head to the ground, for he thought that it had been Abram. So that's that's the same person. Abram and Abraham are the same people. Once God makes Abraham into an nation, he changed the name from Abram to Abraham. And this was concealed from him from that day, and it was forgotten by the king, as it was the will of providence not to suffer Abram's death. So again, Abram is the same person as Abraham. God changed his name. And Terah took Abram, his son, secretly together with his mother and nurse, and he concealed him in a cave and brought them provisions monthly. And the Lord was with Abram in the cave, and he grew up, and Abram was in the cave 10 years, and the king and his princes and soothsayers and sages thought that the king had killed Abram. So that's pretty much the end of this portion of the Book of Jasher, chapter 8. And thank you for going on this journey with me. And please subscribe, share, like, and leave a comment. Shalom.